Hey there! How did you get into my mirror? It's not time yet. I still have a few minutes. Well, now that you're here, let me tell you, today we're gonna talk about the female reproductive system. But I still need to shave, so I'm gonna give you a small introduction. Just like the male reproductive system we talked about last week, the female reproductive system is made of internal and external organs. But for our lesson, we will only focus on the internal organs. That's because those are the ones involved in reproduction. But if you have any questions about the external organs, make sure you ask me at the end of the class. Okay? Perfect. Now that we're done, let me take you to the learning area. Ah, there we are. Now, just to be ready, let me get a better shirt. That's better. Okay, intro please. Welcome to another episode of Teacher Alfredo Explains, and today, the female reproductive system. Thank you for joining us one more time in this Teacher Alfredo Explains. As I told you, we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. And we have discussed puberty before, but let me take a few moments just to review some of the major changes that girls will go through during puberty. For that, I'm going to use this chart. This chart shows the average age in which girls are going to experience several changes of puberty. But remember, each individual is different, so some changes may happen before or after than your friends. Let's take a closer look. Most people will identify the beginning of female puberty when breasts start to grow, which usually happens around the age of 10 and a half, but it can happen since the age of 8 or by the age of almost 13. Another major change in puberty comes with the beginning of the menstrual cycle. When girls experience their very first period, it's called a menarche, which usually happens by the age of 13, but it may occur between the ages of 11 and little after 14. All these changes will happen at different ages for each one of you, but by the age of 18, your body will be fully developed. Moving on! Now, before we go through the organs of the female reproductive system, let's ask ourselves, what is the main function of the female reproductive system? So let me tell you, the female reproductive system will have two main functions. Function number one, the female reproductive system provides the reproductive cell, which is known as the egg cell. And function number two, the female reproductive system will protect and give nutrients to the embryo while it's developing during pregnancy. So, in other words, function number one, we have the reproductive cell, and function number two, it takes care of the embryo during pregnancy. I'm going to give you 1 second to take notes on that, okay? That's it. Okay, don't worry, you can pause it later and take your notes calmly. Moving on, let's take a closer look to the egg cell that we just mentioned, shall we? As you can see, the egg cell and the sperm cell that we saw last week have some differences. It's not only about the size and the shape, but there's going to be several differences as well. Let's take a closer look. In a more technical way, the egg cell is also known as ovum or ova in plural, but it is not capable of moving on its own like the sperm does. The most interesting part of the ovum is that it will be surrounded by two additional sections. Immediately outside the cell membrane, we will have the region known as zona pellucida, which works as a barrier to control the entrance of the sperm cells during fertilization. And beyond that, we have the follicular cells, which are a group of cells surrounding the egg cell in charge of producing certain hormones for the menstrual cycle. That round circle is the nucleus. As in any other cell, it will contain the genetic information. Now let's talk about the female reproductive organs. Okay, the internal organs of the female reproductive system are going to be the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, cervix, and vagina. And to explain the function of each one of them, I want us to see the following diagram. The primary female reproductive organ is going to be the ovary. Now, in the female reproductive system, we'll have two ovaries, similar to the two testes in the male reproductive system. The function of the ovaries is to contain the egg cells. Okay, inside the ovaries is where the egg cells will mature. Just as the sperm cell, the egg cell requires a process of maturation for them to be ready for fertilization. This maturation process will take place inside the ovary. When the process of maturation is completed, the egg cell is going to be released outside of the ovary into our next organ, which is the fallopian tubes. Okay, the fallopian tube will have one particular function, which is to carry the egg cell down into the uterus. If you remember, I told you before, the egg cell has no movement of its own. It cannot swim down into the uterus. It requires the fallopian tube to take it down into the uterus. Okay, fun fact about the fallopian tube: it is there where the fertilization process will happen. Okay, the egg cell and the sperm cell will combine inside the fallopian tube to then carry the zygote into the uterus. Now, the uterus is going to be the central part of the female reproductive system. It plays a very important function because the uterus will contain the embryo during pregnancy, giving the nutrients and protection that it needs for it to become a baby. During the whole process of pregnancy, it will be transforming or changing along with the embryo in order to provide it with the nutrients. But what happens when you're not pregnant? What happens when the uterus doesn't have an embryo? Well, the uterus will also go some changes during the menstrual cycle, but we will talk about that later. Right below the uterus, we will have the cervix, which means entrance, and it's basically the division between the vagina and the uterus, but it has a specific function, which is to regulate the entrance of the sperm cells into the uterus. Depending on the phases of the menstrual cycle, the cervix will allow the pass of sperm cells or it will block them from entering the uterus. Lastly, we have the vagina. It will be a muscular sac that connects the uterus with the outside. It is in the vagina where the sperm cells will be released during sexual intercourse. Now, those are the internal organs of the female reproductive system. If you have any questions, make sure you type them in the chat so I can answer them right away. There are more details that we have to talk about related to the menstrual cycle, but I think I'll leave that for another class. I'll see you next week. Have a nice day.